Welcome back to the Defy Yourself podcast. Once again, thank you so much for listening. If you've checked out our first few episodes so far, I really appreciate it. Today's episode is going to be another curveball. It's going to be a little bit different from anything we've talked about so far, but that's kind of my goal for the podcast, is to keep things different, to keep things unexpected. So there's always different angles to this, notion of defy yourself. Could be in big ways, it could be in small ways, it could be defying your disability, it could be defying your depression, it could be defying your own bad habits, it could be defying your own bad circumstance, but sometimes it could simply be defying your expectations for the day. And that's what I did yesterday. Is I went to a soil conference as part of my job at UC Davis, and I can tell you that I never expected that I would be attending a Soil Health Institute conference for 8 hours, listening to keynote speakers including ag scientists, farmers, researchers, all talking about the health of soil. The reason I'm making a podcast about this is because it's kind of fresh in my mind. It's actually interesting to me outside of work. I never expected going to UC Davis. I knew it was an agricultural school, but I never expected that I would get roped in, so to speak, into ag sciences. So it was a pretty cool experience to attend. I was there by myself. The rest of my team was working back in Davis, but I was sent to take some notes and gain some understandings from leading experts who talk about soil. Now, there's a lot of takeaways from the conference, and if you don't think soil is really that interesting, it turns out it actually is, but I wouldn't blame you for thinking that soil is quite a boring thing. But it turns out that scientists are learning a lot more about all kinds of parts about soil and earth, but some of the main points that came out for me were learning that the microbiome system within the soil itself is extremely extensive and complex. And I guess someone said something to the effect of, I'll probably get the numbers wrong, but 1 gram of soil contains millions of, maybe even 10 millions of different kinds of microbes and microorganisms and fungi and all kinds of different things that are happening at such a micro level that humans can't really perceive it through sight. But things like data analytics, things like machine learning, and of course just like advanced scientific observation are helping soil health advocates, like the people who set up this conference, which had a bunch of people attending, to make some determinations about how to best care for the health of the soil. And like, what does that even mean about the soil being healthy, and how does that, affect us and change our lives? So I have some notes I took here at the conference, and I thought probably keep this to be a short podcast. I don't want to bore you with all the details, but there's a few things that stuck out to me that were very interesting and made me think about soil and agriculture a lot different. And I guess the first thing that was kind of interesting to learn, especially if you're into the whole sustainability of not only farming but energy and how that relates into climate change, and of course like the challenges faced by farmers due to climate change, and then there's some sort of man-made issues like obviously emissions. We all know about CO2 emissions, and I'm not a scientist, so don't quote me on any of this, but my general understanding is that CO2 emissions are going into the atmosphere. Those are creating greenhouse gases, and like somehow that is warming our planet. Well, when we think of emissions, we think of cars and factories and stuff like that, but it turns out that a lot of CO2 is emitted into the atmosphere from dirt that is plowed or tilled. Now, this is a crazy concept, especially for a non-scientific person like me to understand, and I could be wrong. Correct me in the comments below. But CO2 is sequestered into the soil and into the dirt and into the the ground of the earth itself, and that is acquired, I'm assuming, through sunlight, or perhaps there's another way to do it. But all this to say is that a whole bunch of carbon is sequestered into the soil and into the dirt itself. And tilling, of course, is a relatively modern practice of plowing, or of course, like think of a tractor, something that rips up a bunch of dirt and unsettles the dirt, so then they can ride back over it again with a different device that puts a bunch of seeds in there, puts a bunch of plants or whatever crop it is. And these methods have been used for decades, probably since like, the early 1900s, somewhere around that whole like industrialization like thing. But what farmers are finding out is that massive amounts of tilling or plowing is really unhealthy for the soil itself, because as I was saying, there's an advanced network of microbes, and even worms create tunnels that exist within the soil compounds themselves, and those tunnels help with the diffusion of water and the saturation of water into the soil itself, which is like super pivotal of the soil's overall health. So when you rip it all up and then like just pat it all back down, and you compress it too much, that can actually restrict your yields and make your farm environment not as successful or not produce as much. So I guess tilling of the land is actually a bad thing. And one presentation that really struck me was by a gentleman from, let's see here, I have it in my notes. Let me see here. Oh, here it is. A gentleman from Oklahoma who is a farmer. His name is Jimmy Kinder, and he told a story about being a fourth generation farmer whose family experienced fallout from the Dust Bowl, which happened in the Midwest of the United States from about 1935 to 1939 or so. And again, I'm not a scientist. I might not have all the facts straight, but my general understanding of the situation is that a combination of heavy tilling and plowing of the soil in Oklahoma for the purposes of growing, combined with heavy drought conditions, made the soil very loose. And when these big winds came in, and I guess this is sort of like part man-made disaster and then part just like bad luck due to the way that nature was at that time, but huge gusts of winds came in and they blew all of this topsoil, this churned up soil that was sitting on top of the greater soil compounds in Oklahoma. And these, this dust cloud was over a mile high. If you don't know about this, or you've never learned about it, definitely check it out on Wikipedia or something like that, because the fallout from that was just devastating for people, because people's farms were ruined. The land had taken so much abuse from not only tilling but other things that some other scientists at the conference explained, like why is it that certain farms, if they produce dry beans for years on end, will they slowly stop producing as much over time? Well, that's because if you plant the same kind of crop over and over again, season after season, and your garden is dominated by that crop, certain viruses and fungi and infections and parasites will catch on, and they will multiply, and they're going to be duplicitous, you could say, and then cause a rot into the roots of the crop itself. So all these conditions led into this guy's farm, his grandfather's farm at least, that he ended up passing down, to be ruined. And the fallout from the Dust Bowl sort of led to new sustainable practices in Oklahoma, because according to this gentleman, Jimmy Kinder, even to this day in 2019, their soil is still in a sense recovering from that, and they can measure how that's different and how that was affected. And one thing that he does, and I guess it's part of the reason why he's speaking at this conference and why he's such a successful guy overall, is that he sort of quote unquote pioneered no-till farming, which is that you would think it would make perfect sense to tear up all the land and then with a tractor, using machinery, and then just plant a bunch of stuff in there, and then you've done 10 times the work in a quarter of the time, and you would think that that's a win-win across the board. Turns out that this guy started doing it old school style, which is that he planted his crops, I think, by just digging a small hole, sticking the seed in there, and then moving on to the next plot. Now, certain people probably, especially, I think he said when he started doing this in the 80s or 90s, he was a real pioneer. So people looked at him weird, like, why are you doing it this quote-unquote natural old style way? Well, it turned out that no-till farming was actually much more healthy for the land. And Mr. Kinder relayed a really touching and moving anecdote. And this is part of the reason why I'm doing a podcast on this. I know a soil conference sounds like literally the most boring thing possible, but these personal stories and anecdotes really kind of got me thinking and moved me, because we do eat so much that comes from the ground, or we should at least. So we should be concerned about the soil that, obviously nurtures and provides that food alongside with the farmer who's organizing the whole thing. But Mr. Kinder told us a story about his grandfather being on his deathbed. And he had a conversation with his grandfather sort of shortly before he died. And the grandfather, I don't want to take this guy's story, but I just want to give you the essence of it because it was so moving, and I'll talk about why it was so moving. But they were talking about the farm, and he said something to the effect to his grandson, what's going to happen to the farm? Is everything going to be okay? Is the family going to make it? What's the outlook for our land? And I guess at this time, Mr. Kinder had just begun his no-till farming, and he was an innovator and ahead of his time, and he saw not only the potential for more profit and more sustainable growth, but also for enriching the land itself, making the soil more healthy, and therefore it would be more, useful, profitable for not only himself, but future generations of his family too, right? So he's a fourth generation, and he's trying to think about setting this soil up for the seventh generation. So he tells his grandfather about that, and then the grandfather says, will it work? And then Mr. Kinder said, yeah, it is going to work, Grandpa. It's going to go really well because of XYZ. I don't think he actually said that, but I'm sure he gave some kind of reason. And the grandfather said, good. And Mr. Kinder was quite moved when he relayed this anecdote, and he really said that it was something about his grandfather getting a sense of completeness, that not only was the farm going to be successful, but and the other part was, I'll just take a couple steps back now. Kind of what he said was, Grandpa, you've been pushing that plow and tilling that field for so many years now, and I've come up with a new way for us to do it that's going to be better for the family. It's going to be better for the land, and it's going to ensure a generational richness that's going to sustain our family for years to come. And to think about, in his own words, and just my reflection of it too, is for someone who's an older man, a grandfather who's on their deathbed, for them to hear that from their grandson, that he had sort of maybe not invented, but he had just sort of instituted a revolutionary way of thinking about no-till farming, and he was going to make the farm better for everyone. So I think that anecdote and that speech, that little segment there, that kind of encompassed, I think that said a lot about the soil health argument itself, is that if we treat the soil badly, and there's so many different ways that soil can be treated badly, there's a lot of complications. Of course, you think about poorer yields, but there's also a possibility of infections like E. coli and all kinds of nasty things. I'm certainly not qualified to speak about them extensively, but I learned about a lot of the negatives for farmers when their soil is being mistreated. Another man I really enjoyed hearing from was Dr. Bill Robinson, who is a cotton farmer in Arkansas, and he was talking about using cover crops to improve soil health. Again, this might not be interesting unless you're into the nuances of of agriculture, but for me, as someone as a relative outsider, I was like, okay, this is really interesting. And not only was it interesting to learn about the science itself, but to look at these people who were farmers, were from farming families, including Dr. Bill Robinson from Arkansas. All these people, you realize, they're very industrious. And what's kind of cool about ag science, and if you go to UC Davis, you know all about this, or maybe you study this, or you're at least aware of it, is that the sort of intersection of technology and agriculture is getting bigger and bigger and more complex, and soon there's going to be artificial intelligence and machine learning that are dictating all kinds of things about farm environments, indoor farm environments like greenhouses. Same applies to nutrition science and food. A lot of people know about GMOs. They don't like GMOs, but there's going to be a lot of advances that could potentially really benefit people if the potential of GMO tech is like unleashed. I know it's like it's pretty unpopular, I think, to be pro GMO because most people are all about natural stuff, and that there's a big push for that, and I totally sympathize with that. The people that I work for at UC Davis, they're very pro GMO. So I tend to fall in that path as well. I think there's a big gap between scientific education and public perception of what GMOs really are. But anyway, back to Bill Robinson. He was talking about this thing called cover crops. The idea is that if you're a farmer and it's summer and your thing is a part of your field is out of season or it's not being used, instead of just leaving, if you imagine like those lines that you see in the dirt, those like manicured lines you see in the dirt, like in some parts of the country that's considered like conventional practice. Like I know in Texas, for example, that is considered conventional. What some farmers figured out is that if you plant a different kind of cover crop, like maybe rye, like we just heard, or like a legume, or grasses, the soil becomes more healthy and more powerful and more vibrant, which totally makes sense. So if you till and plow your field, like we were talking about earlier, and you rip it up and then you grow it and then you grow it again and again, and then in those periods of time where nothing's being grown, you just leave it there sitting there like dirt, like it just is really bad for the soil's health. So it's a little bit more work, obviously, because you're growing something extra, and also it's a longer term investment, right? Like you might not see the return on the improved soil health for 2 or 3 years. So it's certainly not like an overnight type of thing. But the truth of the matter is that there's a complex ecosystem of bacteria that lives into the soil that plays a huge factor in how much you grow, how long it takes, how healthy it is, how prone it is to disease. So I think his story was really interesting because he's in Arkansas, and this guy, has like a southern accent, and he looks like someone maybe that you would think is from Arkansas, but of course he's a doctor and he's extremely intelligent, and he he's cool. He's a cotton farmer, and he has come up with all these industrious ways to help himself and his community. And then I just really enjoyed hearing his talk about cover crops and how like it is a little bit more work, but a lot more farmers are catching on and realizing like, hey, if I plant this stuff in the meantime between my main cash crop, like so in between cotton season I grow like rye or whatever, that can actually increase profitability for me and overall soil health. So if you think this is kind of interesting or cool, maybe you're into ag science. I'm assuming for most people this episode is going to be kind of like a what. But hopefully some of the interesting stuff is like come across, and maybe, it does fit in with the theme of the show. Like I'm defying my expectations of myself of working in ag science, and I didn't think that I would like it, but I really did. And I went to a conference all by myself, lots of people there, but it was a great experience. I met a couple cool people. I certainly got to listen to a bunch of really cool people. Let's see really quick if there's anyone I should give a shout out to. Karen Ross, California Secretary of Agriculture, was there. She gave a really interesting speech about state goals and mandates for reducing methane, but also a lot of investment, like hundreds of millions of dollars going towards no emission technology, or they're also talking about changing the zero carbon emissions into renewable carbon. So that was kind of a theme as well. There's so many interesting people who spoke. There was a man from Australia who grew up in Wales who talked about soil security. I found that to be pretty interesting. I'm just kind of scanning through my notes right now, but to be honest, some of the stuff was kind of above my head, like some people doing very specific phenotyping and analysis of different soils and nutrient cycles and stuff like that. So I did my best to follow along, but for the most for the most part, there was another guy called Klaus Martins, and you can Google him. But he sort of told a story about being a farmer in the 80s and growing dry beans, dry edible beans. And they were making a lot of profit on that, and they grew these beans over and over, like season after season. And soon enough, he noticed that his beans weren't growing as much anymore, and then they were really slowing down, and their yield was plummeting. So he'd pull up his beans, and he'd see that the roots were all rotted. And the reason why is that if you grow the same crop over and over in the same field, the microbes, the bacteria that attack that kind of crop for their own sustenance, like as a like a parasite, or maybe just an infection, fungus, sickness, disease, whatever you call it, they'll catch on and they'll be there for when there's all those beans. So there's a specific kind of bacteria that eats the roots of the beans. So they figured out, but by planting a cover crop, and by instead of doing just one thing, they do like 16 different varieties of things, and that helps diversify the ecosystem of bacteria in the soil, and therefore there's less like certain infections that come up and just totally ruin his crop. So that was Klaus Martins. He was a very interesting man to listen to, and I really appreciated hearing his perspective as well. I think we've gone on for a good amount of time. We've done about 25 minutes here, so I guess we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for listening. Definitely check out our other episodes of Defy Yourself. This train has totally left the station, so I'm totally on board with creating more episodes. I've already planned a bunch more. It's not all going to be about soil or ag science. This is kind of a one-off in that respect, but you can expect this podcast is going to be a little bit different every day. Not just the same thing. We're going to be on location in certain places. We're going to be interviewing people that you'd never expect to be interviewed. We're going to be having conversations about fun things, sad things, serious things, and everything in between. Thank you so much for listening to Defy Yourself. My name is Kit Duggan. I really do appreciate you checking out the podcast, and I hope you'll join us next time. Thanks so much.